I would like now to move to Julius Kanpp from FCC. He's here represent 5G America. He's chief of the Federal Communication Commission Office of Engineering Technology, OET, to provide his views on spectrum harmonization. Thank you.
I was chuckling because Francisco looked over and saw an empty chair and thought maybe I left. So, good afternoon. This morning I thought you heard a little bit about the need for new thinking, new ideas. For those of you who've been working in the spectrum area, you know these problems are really hard. You know, the days of just identifying, just tell me which spectrum is empty and we'll use it. It's not there. So let's see if I can get this working. There we go. Well, we're already halfway through.
White. Is the blue screen?
Yeah, blue screen. So this is good. This one?
Yes, only the white.
Only the white one. Good. So this morning we talked a bit about low, mid, and high spectrum. You've heard about that. What I'm going to talk about is not the details of the spectrum and the bands quite as much as the concepts that are involved in trying to free up spectrum. So a few years back, you might have heard me and others from the FCC talking about this crazy idea for an incentive auction in the TV bands. I've quipped to people before, if you ever want to find out what's in a spectrum band that you think is lightly loaded, just propose to reallocate it. Suddenly you'll find out all the things that are there. So what's so different about this is, for the first time, certainly in the US, we've said to the incumbents, if you're willing to get out of the business, to turn in your spectrum license for a fee, voluntarily, we may be able to clear spectrum that way. So this was called a reverse auction, where TV broadcasters could decide to forfeit their 6 megahertz of spectrum, maybe through a business agreement, do multicasting on another channel with another broadcaster in that area. So we have the reverse auction where the broadcaster said, here's how much money it would take for me to get out, and a forward auction for the wireless carriers to bid. When the two amounts basically even out, the auction closed. Closed at 84 megahertz. It was successful. One of the major winners, wireless carriers, are already deploying there. What we need to do, we're in the process of repacking the television stations to create these clear blocks of spectrum. But in the meantime, there's still the ability to operate in certain markets, and the one carrier has announced that they're evolving to 5G in that space. So instead of auction, brand new idea. We created something called the Citizens Broadband Radio Service. It's an advanced dynamic spectrum access system. Why would we do this? Because there were Navy radars in the spectrum, and there was no other place to put them. But the Navy radars are not there most of the time. And if you think about it, there's a lot of bands that we've had through the years where we may have a use that's only temporary, or it's used a couple of weeks, or it's in a particular location, and the arguments have been, well, we can't, when we need it, and we can't share. The idea here is the spectrum access system, basically a computer brain, would allow access when the Navy radars aren't present. For the first time, we've combined licensed use and unlicensed use. We've identified, out of the total of 150 megahertz, this runs from 3550 to 3700 megahertz, right in the band that is so much a focus worldwide for 5G. 70 megahertz of that is dedicated for licenses that will ultimately be auctioned. The rest of it is available to anyone. The beauty of that is at any given location, where historically where we've worked in the spectrum field of saying this is the right amount for this use or this is the right amount around that use, and then we wind up with areas where spectrum is stranded. Instead, this will let the market determine the use in any given area. The other thing we did here is we just set a basic framework, and we set up a multi-stakeholder process for industry to fill in all the blanks, all the details of how the sharing will work. So we're pretty close. We've announced to have the initial commercial deployments. I think they'll start next year. The technology's already been developed. Folks are looking to develop and deploy 5G technologies in this space relatively soon. There's a lot of excitement about this. Mid-band. Again, at 3.7 and 6 gigahertz. We're doing things that I think years ago would have been viewed as untouchable. So it involves the C-band satellite service largely in the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band. We started proceeding to look at ways to recover that spectrum. And the satellite industry has come forward and said they're willing to clear spectrum through private business arrangements with the carriers. So this is an open proceeding. That's one of several options that's being looked at. But in the US, there is a proposal outstanding to free up a good part of that spectrum for wireless services, particularly 5G. And on the high side, the uplink side, where we have a heavy fixed deployment use, we propose to make this available for unlicensed use on a shared basis. Then it's what people tend to think of as 5G, high band spectrum. I won't go into the details, but we've allocated spectrum at 28 gigahertz, 37, 39 gigahertz, 24 and 47 gigahertz already, and we proposed more. We've also are considering what can be done at 26. We already have an auction going on at 28, auction planned at 24. And we, for next year, for 37, 39, and 47. So things are moving. I'm going to kind of skip through a couple of points here in these slides. These are more details about what was in the bands. But we really came up with novel ways to share in each space. So we're excited. Again, we don't view these as the exclusive 5G bands, but rather as part of a total package of things that people will deploy. So I talked about the FAST plan this morning. One other thing, in those bands at 28 gigahertz, for example, and 39 gigahertz, we already had a significant part of the country that was licensed for fixed wireless use. So what did we do? Rather than the old method of saying, well, let's cancel those licenses and move them out, instead we gave them the authority to offer mobile service, and there were business transactions, and there's a lot of action going on there. I think this is the last, no, there's one more slide. Satellite services. I was glad to hear this morning satellite being mentioned as part of the 5G package. We've been licensing what are effectively broadband, new generation of low Earth orbiting satellites, and they're going to be providing bandwidths that I think we never contemplated in the past, low latency for satellite services. So this is the last slide on harmonization. The main point here is that in that 3 gigahertz region that we've been talking about, we already have that CBRS band that I mentioned. Right above it, we're looking at additional spectrum from the C-band satellite downlink spectrum. And below it, our Department of Defense is studying providing spectrum in 100 megahertz from 3450 to 3550. So we're not far off from lining up with what everybody else is doing, I think, in the rest of the world. And the last point, even though the higher bands don't match exactly, the technology has evolved. It's all software-defined radios now. Where before, it was so important that we had an exact match, because you built the radio with a set of parts and it was one band specific. Now, we understand this is not without its limitations, but we have far more flexibility when bands are pretty close together to have a single radio design that covers both. Thanks for your attention.